really delighted to have with us our first keynote speaker of the 2017 Global Street Paper Summit. Richard Wilkinson is a Professor Emeritus of Social Epidemiology at the University College of London. And he's also Honorary Professor at the University College of London and also Visiting Professor of University of York. So a very busy person indeed. So we're really happy that he's joined us here today to kick off the day one of the summit. He also co-founded the Equality Trust and is possibly best known to some of you for having written the book The Spirit Level, which I read a few years ago, and I know I've been speaking to a few other people over the course of the past day or two who've really enjoyed that book. I think, as with the last couple of years, I think the idea with our keynotes is to give us a bit of the wider context for the world that we are operating in. So I think that's a really quite a useful and positive way to start the first day in particular. And Richard will be talking to us about equality and the difference in success, I guess, of societies that are more and less equal. And I think that's a really interesting concept and hopefully something that you feel will be relevant to the work that you all do. So thank you very much, Richard, for taking the time and hope you enjoy the talk. We'll have a Q&A afterwards as well.
Well, thank you all. It's nice to be here. I find this as an audience quite daunting. I normally speak to academics and people who are more detached from the real world, and so less to be feared. But I think many people here know the practicalities of what I'm talking about better than I do. The work I've done on the effects of inequality really started off around thinking about health inequalities, the huge differences in life expectancy between rich and poor. I think many people imagine that health has improved since, I don't know, the 19th century because of modern medicine. That's not really right. Medicine has made a contribution, but nearly all the decline in the great infectious diseases came from improvements in material living standards. And people often think, when I say that must be clean water and sewerage and so on, but most of those big infectious diseases were airborne. So that's only a part of the answer. But when you look at the determinants of health, nearly all the determinants are social and economic factors. So you see here we have the different sectors, the genetics, that little genetic sector, the big behavioral bit, that 30%, healthcare, that little 10% slice, social conditions, that big 55%. And if you add together the behavioral stuff to the social conditions, you'll see nearly all the determinants of health, even now, are a matter of how you live, your circumstances. And indeed, that means that what people have in public health, we in public health always run up against political issues, whether we're talking about more public expenditure or need for smaller income differences or whatever. And I think this statement of 19th century German pathologist Rudolf Virchow is still very, very true. Medicine is a social science, and politics are nothing else than medicine on a large scale. You know, health is about how to improve the circumstances in which we live, but also crucial in that is the quality of social relations between people. Friendship is extraordinarily protective of health. However, when people think about the enormous effects of poverty on health, I think basically most people misunderstand the issue. And of course it's important to have enough money for food and so on, but in most of our rich developed societies, the issue is really low social status. What low social status makes us feel about our circumstances, how we feel seen and judged, looked down on, seen as inferior, all those kinds of feelings. I want to read you just a a couple of paragraphs from a study of poverty in different countries. It was a study of poverty in Uganda, India, China, Pakistan, Korea, United Kingdom and Norway. So both rich and poor countries. And of course, poverty means totally different things in those societies. You know, in India, it might mean living in a little shack with an earth floor, just one room, no water, and probably very little in the way of cooking facilities, and no sewerage. If you take not just the bottom 1%, but if you take the poorest 10 or 20% in countries like Britain and Norway, it means living in a 3-bedroom house, 2 or 3-bedroom house, usually with central heating and probably a flat-screen television. So poverty means totally different things. And yet this study, which interviewed people in poverty in those different countries, found that the experience of poverty in those very different material conditions was almost exactly the same. They said, this is simply quoting from the study, I should give you the reference. Respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised by their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite respondents generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. No one was able to escape the shaming of failing to provide for their children, even when their children were prepared to stop asking for things, the latter itself being a further source of shame. For men, relying on others or on welfare benefits was perceived as a challenge to their sense of masculinity. A British father to 2 children admitted, "I feel like shit. I'm the man in this relationship. I'm meant to be the man, to take care of the missus and my kids, and I don't." Now, increasingly, working on health inequalities, it's become clear how important the chronic stress of being seen as inferior, of low social status, our extraordinary sensitivity to social status issues, to being disrespected, humiliated, and so on, are really powerful influence on health. So I think we must see poverty not simply as a certain... there was an American anthropologist who said, poverty is not just a certain small amount of goods. It's an invidious distinction between classes. And we have to, I think, incorporate that in our understanding of it, because in at least rich societies, that is probably the larger part of the damage that poverty and inequality, relative poverty and inequality do. I want to show you 2 indications of how those feelings of inferiority, inferior status, do the damage. The first actually comes from studies of people working with non-human primates. This woman on the left, Carol Shively, studies macaque monkeys in captivity. And she keeps them in the same material conditions. So there isn't material poverty amongst them. There's just low social status or high amongst the dominant animals. So she keeps them in the same compounds, she gives them the same food, so no material conditions. But of course they have a ranking system, and she's pointing out the third up arteries of a low status animal. On the left of that little screen she's pointing to are the clear arteries of a dominant animal. And of course the physiology of the effects of chronic stress has a lot in common between humans and animals. and Robert Sapolsky on the right, who studies baboons in captivity. His work has really informed so much of, and because we endlessly in health inequalities battled against, is it the direct effects of poor material conditions, or is it the effects of low social status itself? And he darts the baboons and takes blood samples in the moment or two that they're unconscious, and then relates various stress hormones and so on to the position of the animals in the dominance hierarchy. And the results of much of his work closely echoes or parallels what we see amongst civil servants. Big health studies of civil servants, where they are ranked, of course, by position in the hierarchy, from the most senior office staff to the most junior. This is another indication of the same thing, that inferior social status is damaging. These are Indian children from different castes, high and low caste children, and they're given little pen and paper tests to do. And they have to see how many they can do in a particular length of time. And they do them in two conditions. One where nobody knows who's high and low caste, and they perform equally well. And then when they do know who's high and who's low caste, where a big gap opens up. Social status itself is crucially important. The last indication of that same process, you can see from comparing different countries and the importance of income within and between countries. First, I'm going to show you this graph of life expectancy. Each dot there is a country, and along the bottom you've got GDP per capita, where countries are in the long process of economic growth. And so you see the countries on the left here, poorer countries, rapid rises in life expectancy in the early stages of economic growth, and then it levels out. So the rich countries out here, it doesn't really make much difference whether they're on $20,000 per capita or on $40,000. I'm just to show you that on a larger scale. These are just the rich countries on the flat part of that thing, and you see Norway and USA twice as rich as some of the countries on the left, and it doesn't make any difference to life expectancy at all. And yet, within our societies, there are these extraordinary regular gradients in health right across the society. This is rather old data. I go on using it because it shows there's fine gradations of health right across our society. So as it's old data, now all those bars should be a tiny bit higher because life expectancy has increased. But you see people in the poorest areas on the right have low life expectancy, and the people on the left, high life expectancy. And it's not just a difference between the poor and everyone else. It's graded right. We are all part of this picture. To understand it, you have to think why the people just below the top do less well than the people at the top. But look, I've shown you an extraordinary paradox. Income differences between the rich developed countries make no difference to health at all. And yet here, within our societies, income looks as if it's extraordinarily important. And the explanation of that paradox is that within our societies, we're looking at the effects of relative income or social status, how your income compares with other people. And when you've got that idea, you should start thinking, what happens if we make the differences between us bigger or smaller? And that's really what I can tell you about. And actually, I'm going to show you lots of graphs like this. Income inequality, i.e. making the differences between us bigger or smaller, and its effects on problems. The bigger the income differences, the more of a whole range of problems you have. The data we use, it comes from the UN Human Development Report, but it's the same as the World Bank have. And you see the measure we've used is how much richer the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%. How big is that gap between them? And in the Scandinavian countries, on the left here, you see the top 20% are getting 3.5 or 4 times as much as the bottom 20%. But in the countries on the right, the gap is twice as big. They're all rich, developed market democracies, and yet there's this really important difference between us. What we did was we took this data, this international data showing the inequalities in each country, and compared it with the frequency of a whole range of problems. The problems we were looking at, that we compiled, getting data from the World Health Organization or OECD or various sources like that. And we didn't compile the data, we just downloaded it from people like WHO. So we had life expectancy, we had children's maths and literacy scores, we had infant mortality rates, we had homicide rates, imprisonment rates, teenage birth rates, trust, obesity. Trust is how much people feel they can trust other people in society, from the World Values Survey. Obesity rates, mental illness, which in the standard psychiatric classification of mental illnesses includes drug and alcohol addiction as if it was a mental illness, and some figures on social mobility. So for all those things, we have the average for each country. And here it is. We put them all into one index. So where a country is its sort of average performance on those different things. Higher is worse outcomes. So the measure of income inequality is the rainbow stripes I've just shown you. And the countries on the right are doing much worse on all those kinds of problems than the countries, the more equal ones on the left. It's an extraordinary close relationship. We thought people might say, well, you know, they've just jiggled the figures around, chosen things that suit their argument. And so to protect ourselves from that criticism, we looked also at the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing, made up, nothing to do with us, made up by people at UNICEF to measure child well-being in rich countries. It has about 40 different components. So what children's immunization rates are like, whether there's bullying in schools, whether kids feel they can talk to their parents, all that kind of thing. About 40 different measures like that go into this UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. And here it is in relation to inequality. The more unequal countries on the right, USA, Portugal, UK, doing badly, and the Scandinavian countries and Japan doing well. We've just, actually that's the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing we show in our book is an earlier one than this. And we've been able to look at changes over time, and the countries that have had faster rises in income inequality have had declines in child well-being. So, for instance, where Sweden is, so although Sweden is a more egalitarian country, its income differences have widened. And what's happened to child well-being is almost exactly predicted by what's happened to income distribution. So, all these kinds of things seem to get worse. I think I'm going to skip one or two. Imprisonment rates, I'll show you, much higher in more unequal countries. There's what's called a logged scale up the side, which sort of compresses the top. If it was not on a log scale, this line would go curving up, and the USA would be off the top of the screen. But look at the scale of the differences. It's harder to judge the intervening points on a log scale, but Japan is about 40 prisoners per 100,000 population. The USA is over 400. So there's a tenfold difference in the proportion of the population locked up in more and less equal countries. A little of that is more crime, but most of it is more punitive sentencing. Prison systems are harsher, and you get longer sentences for smaller crimes in more unequal countries. When we were writing our spirit level book, we found that there were 300 people imprisoned in California, in the American state of California, life imprisonment for shoplifting on the 3 strikes and you're out principle. And really appalling brutality, and completely unacceptable. Mental illness. Again, note the big differences. This is the proportion of the population in each country with any mental illness in the preceding year. It's not simply people going into the doctors and saying, I'm depressed or anxious, because that would be too influenced by how you access medical care in different countries. These figures come from the World Health Organization. They put them together using the same diagnostic interviews on random samples of the population in each country. So you are not asked, have you been diagnosed with depression? You are asked about your sleeping patterns, your feelings of self-worth, your appetite, all sorts of things like that are found to be diagnostic of mental illnesses. And you see down here you've got about, that's 8% of the population with any mental illness, and it goes up to over 3 times that level in some of those countries. I could go on showing you those till the cows come home. I suppose not many cows come home to Manchester, but still. I will show you a few more. One of them is social mobility. I think people often think that inequality is somehow fair if people can find their right level in society. You know, the idea that if you work hard, you end up at the top, and if you don't, you end up at the bottom. The idea that the poor are poor because they're stupid and lazy, all that kind of thing. But actually what the evidence shows, get mixed up between these two things, is that social mobility is lower in societies with bigger income differences in the population. The measure of social mobility is actually fathers' and sons' incomes. It's intergenerational mobility, so really it's asking, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons? It's not mothers and daughters, because there are such big changes in women's economic activity rates that it's harder to make these calculations between generations. And what it shows here is if you are concerned with equal opportunities for children, the most important thing you can do is reduce the inequalities amongst their parents. Absolutely crucial. I want to show one or two a few points about housing. This is a paper by Becky Tunstall at the University of York, and look just at that top line. It's the inequalities in rooms per person in this country, in England and Wales. It compares rooms per person with in the top 10%, the people who have most rooms per person, with the 10% who have least rooms per person. And you see that inequalities in rooms per person declined through most of the century until the 1980s. And then there's the huge takeoff of inequality simply in housing. And if you look at what happens to income inequality, this is different countries, the 20th century, and you see a long, slow decline of income inequalities, and then the takeoff of income inequalities during the 1980s in one country after another. You know, the ideology of neoliberalism, which was behind the modern rise of inequality, of course, is an international ideology, so it affects one country after another. So, you know, you can't really solve the housing problem, the problems of homelessness, unless you reduce the inequalities between us. And the situation now is appalling, that 1 in 10 adults have a second home, but 4 in 10 adults own no property at all. And that trend's been getting worse. And, after decades and decades of progress from the early part of the 19th century until 1980s, it's all being undone. And it really is. It's a terrible, terrible picture. I want to give you now, just to encapsulate, what inequality does to social relations, the relationships between us. If you like, what it does to life on the streets. First, this graph shows participation in local community groups and so on. Whether people belong to local organizations, associations, gardening groups, whatever it is. And you see at the more unequal end on the right, people are less likely to belong to anything. There are other measures of involvement in community life. And study after study now shows that what happens with greater inequality is you get an atrophying of community life. People have less to do with each other. There are also studies now which show that people are less willing to help each other in more unequal societies. Less willing to help neighbors, less willing to help the elderly or people with disabilities and so on. There are measures of trust too. How much whether people agree with the statement, most people can be trusted. And you see very big differences. Out on the right, you've got about, 15 or 20% of the population who feel they can trust others. But in the more equal societies, it's 60 or 65% feel they can trust others. And if you've got to walk home late at night in a big city, you'd feel far safer doing it in one of the more equal societies. In the more unequal societies, you really need to be aware of who's around you on the street. And in the more equal ones, you can relax, you can let that go, you don't have to be on your guard. When you look at much more unequal societies, in this data set, Portugal, USA, Singapore are the most unequal. But of course, countries like Mexico or South Africa are much more unequal. And when you go to those countries, you find that people are frightened of each other. Their houses are... break off a moment. I should just explain. The other thing that happens is with more inequality is violence rises. There are now 50 or 60 studies of homicide rates in relation to inequality. And there are these huge differences. These red dots are American states, and these ones are Canadian provinces. And homicides per million people go from, that would be 15 homicides per million people, up to 150. Tenfold differences in homicide rates, closely related to inequality. So not only does community life atrophy, people feel they can trust each other less, they're less helpful to each other, there's more violence. But as I say, if you go to countries like Mexico, you find that people barricade their houses, these huge fences around them, and razor wire on the top, bars on the windows and doors. You're really afraid of other people. And exactly the same in South Africa. Those wires on the top you can just about see, that's an electric fence. And the notice says armed response. So if you're seen climbing in, you might get shot. And there's some, if you don't get shot, you'll be eaten by those huge dogs you can see Those are dogs. I'm sorry the picture isn't this. And it's not just one or two houses. It's most houses in many streets are barricaded like this. So you move from these societies with a good deal of reciprocity, neighborliness, and community life to societies where there's fear, violence, lack of trust. That's a catastrophe for any society, but it's what inequality does to us. One other bit of evidence that shows exactly the same process on the basis of totally different kind of data is this. This comes from two American economists, and I got this graph from an article they wrote for the New York Times, but they've published this in an academic journal, and they've shown not only this pattern for different countries, but they've shown it for different American states. What it shows is that the proportion of the population involved in what they call guard labor, people like police, security staff, prison officers, all those sorts of occupations, becomes a larger proportion of the labor force in more unequal countries. These are the people who protect us from each other. Exactly the same thing as we were seeing before, but on a totally different kind of data. Now, people are often surprised that inequality is related to so many different outcomes, and as I say, I could have shown you many more. I think it's wrong to think that these are they're just quite separate outcomes. We all know that the educational performance of school children is worse in the poorest areas. Health is worst in the poorest areas. Usually violence is higher in the poorest areas. A whole range of problems get worse at the bottom of the social scale. And income inequality is not something different from what we've always known about the importance of class and status for these outcomes. It's telling us more about that relationship. That if you like, the material, the economic differences between us are what structures the social hierarchy. You know, whether we live in a hierarchy, a class system that's a very steep one like that, or a much shallower one like that, is a matter of the scale of the material differences between us. How far we can live quite separate lives because of our different incomes. And of course, as many sociologists have pointed out, we use our incomes where we can to express status. The car we drive, the clothes we have, the kind of phone we have, you know, all those kinds of things. What I think is the surprising part of it, and basically all the problems related to greater inequality are problems which have those social gradients more common at the bottom of society. But what is surprising, inequality doesn't just affect the people at the bottom. It affects the vast majority of society. I'm just going to give you one very quick, simple illustration of that. These are the literacy scores, the reading scores, reading and writing of children in these three different countries. They're arranged by how many years of education their parents have had. So on the right here, you have kids with well-educated parents. Their parents have had 12, 13, 14, or even 15 years of education. But down this end are the children of poorly educated parents. Only had 4, 5, 6, 7 years of education. And what you see is in a more equal country like Sweden, the social gradient is much gentler than it is in the more unequal United States. But what this is telling you, and a number of other graphs I could show you if I had time, is not that the USA has more poor people, or more people with poorly educated parents. It's saying wherever you come, you do worse. in a more unequal society. So the differences are biggest at the bottom of society, but even at the top, it seems to make a small difference to be in a more equal country. And judging from the academic papers, it looks as if you've got to make a generalization about the effects of inequality, this is the nearest you can get to the truth. It affects the people at the bottom most, but the vast majority of the population are affected to a smaller extent. Now, I want to say a few words about how inequality does its damage to us. One of the interesting studies people have done, they've done it over and over again, is to see what happens to people's levels of stress hormones measured in saliva or in blood when you're given stressful things to do. So these are done with volunteers in psychological experiments. And hundreds of those studies have been done around the world. And in this, what's called a meta-analysis, which looked at actually 208 of those studies, they were looking to see what kind of stressful things most reliably push up your levels of stress hormones. Is it having a nasty noise all the time while you're trying to do something? Or is it having to do mathematical problems? Is it being asked to write about an unpleasant experience you've had? Is it having to speak to give a little talk to other volunteers in the group? Or being videoed while you do something? And what they concluded is that the tasks which most reliably push up stress hormones are tasks that involve what they call social evaluative threat. That's threats to self-esteem or social status where others can judge your performance negatively. That's why we all recognize that public speaking is stressful. We don't like making fools of ourselves in front of other people. And you can see very easily how inequality would affect that. In more unequal societies, some people seem hugely important, and other people at the bottom are regarded as almost worthless. We all worry more about how we are seen and judged. And indeed, you can see that concern with status increases in more unequal societies. So we judge each other more by status, and that really gets to us. It affects levels of stress hormones, and it's chronic stress that has the health effects that I started out by talking about. But we can see now from studies that there is more status anxiety, more worry about how you're seen and judged in more unequal societies. Let me explain this one. Here you've got different income groups. That's the richest tenth of the population in each country on the right, and this is the poorest tenth of of the population in each country. The more unequal countries is this top line, where you see higher levels of status anxiety across all income groups. Status anxiety is highest amongst the poor, but even amongst the rich, you see it's much higher than it is in the low inequality countries. The bottom line is low inequality countries. So right across the income group, status anxiety is pushed up. Life is more about, whether you're seen as successful, respected in terms of how much money you make, your position in society. That's how we judge whether people, it's using people's external wealth as an indication of their internal worth. And I'm sure you see how this relates to the feelings of people who are on the streets and so on. And there are two responses we've just sent another book manuscript off to our publisher, and there are two responses to whole societies being more worried about status. One is that you go under with feelings of low self-esteem, lack of confidence, feelings of inferiority, becoming depressed, withdrawing from social life, because that sense of being judged by other people is too stressful. So social contact becomes an ordeal. You try and avoid it, you withdraw. The other response is the opposite of that. You start talking yourself up. You start, instead of being modest about your achievements and abilities, you start flaunting them. You go in for processes that have been called self-advancement. Let me show you first that there's more depression in more unequal societies. These are American states, higher depression in more unequal states. But then what I was just getting on to, self-enhancement, increases in more unequal countries. So here what's called self-enhancement is, you could call it self-aggrandizement or self-advertisement. People in these countries are asked, how do you think you compare to the average in your country? And do you people think you're more intelligent than most people in Britain? Do you think you're more generous? Do you think you're more attractive? So you rate yourself compared to what you imagine is the national average. And in more unequal countries, people flaunt what they talk themselves up. It's like the joke that, 90% of drivers think they're better drivers than the average. It's that sort of story. So you get those two opposite responses to being more worried about status. The low self-esteem, the lack of confidence amongst some people, and amongst others, that self-advertisement, which comes from just the same insecurity about how you're seen and judged. Right, I think I've just about done. Also, inequality increases conspicuous consumption, because money is how you show what you're worth, and people in more unequal societies work longer hours. They get into debt more because they borrow more. As I say, money becomes more important. That's what's happened to inequality in the 20th century, as I showed you earlier. Long, slow decline from the 1930s to about 1980, and then the modern rise of inequality. It's a reflection of first the strength and then the weakening of the whole labor movement, the whole idea that society can be run in some other way. The fear of communism first strengthens and then declines. You can see it in the strength of trade unions. That top line, this is American data, is the share of income going to the top 10% of the population. So you see it declined until the late 70s, and then there's a modern rise of inequality. The bottom line is the proportion of the population in trade unions. Exactly the opposite pattern. So what you're looking at, I don't think it's because that trade unions do such amazing things for the wages of their members. I think they help. But I think trade union membership is an indication of the strength, the healthiness and the power of the whole labour movement as a countervailing voice in society. And I think now we've lost so much of that. We have to move towards all forms of economic democracy, employee ownership, cooperatives, employee representation on company boards, all sorts of forms like that. That's, I see, as the next big project for human emancipation. So I'm going to stop now. I've probably spent more time than I should.
Thanks very much indeed to Richard Wilkinson. I'm sure you'll all agree that was absolutely fascinating and really eye-opening. And even for us in this room who deal with the sharp end of inequality on a daily basis, I think that was still really fascinating to see how different types of data and different measures support this theory as well. So I'm sure there are some questions, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. So if you could just raise your hand if you have any questions for Richard, and we'll get a roving mic around as well. This roving mic, in fact. So if you want to put your hands up with any questions.
My hearing is so bad, you'll probably have to repeat questions for me. All totally satisfied. So if you can get the nub of the question.
Hello, yeah. Hi, Professor Richard.
Yes, I can hear.
Right. Fascinating, speech there. But in terms of solutions to these inequalities, what would you suggest, or what work have you done in terms of bringing up solutions to resolve these inequalities?
Solutions, yes. Well, taxes in this country, and I think many others, are no longer progressive. You know, people like Warren Buffett have said that their cleaner pays a higher proportion of their income in tax than he does. And our Equality Trust has looked at taxation overall, and the poor pay a higher proportion of their income in tax than the rich. That's a reversal of what we used to have. We have to make taxes progressive again, but before you can do that, you've got to stop the rich being able to hide their money away in tax havens. And what happens now, you raise the top tax rates, and you don't get as much more money back as you'd expect, because more of them now have an incentive to hide their money away. So the first thing is to deal with the tax havens, avoid and clamp down on tax avoidance. And all these complicated financial manipulations people go in for to avoid tax, that the rich go in for to avoid tax, because I think they're quite expensive to set it up, so only the rich do those things. If the purpose of those schemes is clearly simply to avoid tax, they must be disregarded. There was recently an important legal decision that seemed to come close to establishing that, but if it needs more legislation to do that, then that's what we must have. So if the rich set up schemes to avoid tax, even if each step of the scheme is legal, if its overall purpose is to avoid tax, it must be disregarded. That's the only way of taking care of all the loopholes, all the possible loopholes. And of course, the big financial, the accountancy companies and people who advise on this kind of thing, they're all in influencing governments, designing loopholes. So you've got to take that sort of approach. But you see, what the weakness of just redistributing through taxes and benefits is, as soon as you get another government in that doesn't like it, they can undo it all. That's why I emphasize forms of economic democracy. And, you know, in the FTSE 100 companies, the average pay difference between the CEOs at the top and the average worker or the low-paid workers, it's about 300 to 1. So, and that has grown really since the 1980s. I do have a slide of that, but it'll take up more time. And I think that has happened because now that trade unions have been weakened, there is no constraint on what the rich do. And I think we must deal with that through forms of economic democracy. About half the member countries of the European Union have some, at least often weak, legislation for insisting on employee representation on company boards. It's usually token representation. But we must ideally, and if we get a more progressive government in sometime in the next 5 years or so, we must try and have a program for gradually increasing over time the proportion of employees on the board. And if we had something that, they'd gain 2% per year, then in 20, 25 years, they'd be in a majority. Employers would have the majority. And you might think your boss should get, 50% more than you, twice as much as you, but you probably wouldn't vote for him getting 300 times as much. More democratic firms have much smaller income differences within them. And the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, it's about 1 to 5 or sometimes as much as 1 to 10, but much smaller differentials. The advantage of doing it that way is that it's much harder for governments to undo that. They can't suddenly legislate that particular companies should cease to have employee. Once you've embedded greater rights, increased democracy, it's much harder to undo it. And I think where hierarchy is most prevalent, most dominant, is at work with a chain of command and seniority and all that kind of thing expressed in pay differences.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Richard. Any other questions? We've still got 5 minutes for a couple more questions. Faye?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, whilst we're trying to reduce the inequalities and we're all moving to Sweden for a short-term fix, what are we doing? Is there any evidence around psychosocial interventions that can help build self-esteem or reduce the impacts of inequality on poor people? Because that's what we do every day. Yeah. We work with poor people who are suffering this
I think it's
battering of their self-esteem. Is there any evidence that shows that that's worthwhile?
It's an uphill struggle if you try and make substantial improvements without dealing with the basic income inequalities. But friendship is enormously protective. Studies that combine the data from, I think it's 150 studies of friendship and health, find that friendship is, whether or not you have friends, is as important to health in a follow-up period as whether or not you smoke. It's not just a vague thing. It's not just when you do big observational studies and try and control out the effects of class and education and income. It's even in experiments where you make little wounds on the arms of volunteers and they heal more slowly if they have poor relationships with people because they're more stressed. You can give people nasal drops with cold viruses in and they sniff them up. And if they have fewer friends, they're 4 times as likely to catch a cold from that same measured exposure to infection. And this isn't, these studies are really sophisticated ones. So in all the people involved, they've measured the levels of antibodies they have to the cold viruses they use before they start the study. This is really good work. And so friendship is one of the things that are really important. But I think people getting together, and what's worst is feeling that you're isolated, your life has fallen to bits, you're never going to put it together. And I think not blaming yourself. I sometimes show a picture of a hurdles race. Children, some school sports, I expect, going over hurdles. And, nearly all the studies of why people get involved in drugs or crime or their marriages break up or they have bad health are studies of individual differences. If you want to know which children will fall when going over the hurdles, you look at individual differences. If you want to know how many fall, you look at the height of the hurdles. Some societies make life more difficult overall, and that's basically what I'm talking about. But people blame themselves endlessly, and that's what I started off reading about the shame associated with poverty in different countries, the self-loathing and so on. And those sorts of feelings are hugely stressful and hugely damaging. And of course, as again we've shown in the data, what you do when you're with those sorts of levels of anxiety, the drugs and so on, the alcohol, is how you try and give yourself a bit of a break. And yet it leads to more difficulties. So people getting together, not blaming themselves, friendship, social solidarity, all those things offset that feeling of being isolated, looked down on, hopeless at the bottom. But basically, we've got to get rid of the grading of people by these big economic differences, reduce all that.
I think until we've solved inequality, we should probably all recognise the health benefits of the INSP summit, based on what you said just then. We've got time for one more question. I think there was someone waiting at the back.
Thanks, Professor Wilkinson. It's nice to hear what you had to say. Got a quick question. Well, actually two. I'll try to be quick with it. So this all aligns with some other reading I've done with like Thomas Piketty and income inequality and all that good stuff. I guess the question I really have is, I'm looking at that graph, I'm looking at the years, I'm looking at inequality, and I'm going, I know what happened from 1928 to 1943, 44, and then I see us going in the same direction. What is the natural end of income inequality? Is there some place that it takes us? Is it global cataclysm, or is it something else?
Sorry, what is the natural, what did you say? What is
the end point to that?
The natural end point. Are we going a certain direction? What's the outcome that, if we keep going this direction, what happens?
Well,
other than obviously terrible
when people
things.
ask me that question, they're usually asking me whether it leads to some sort of revolutionary upheaval. There are a few studies which suggest that civil strife of various forms, including assassinations and so on, are a bit more likely. But I'm afraid human societies have lived for hundreds of years with the most appalling tyrannical inequalities and dictatorships. You can't count on it.
That's a good answer. I think that's probably all we have time for, actually, on that worrying note.
Okay.
Thanks very much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you. Okay, just a couple of points then. So we have lunch now for an hour from 12:30 to 1:30, and the lunch will be served upstairs.